If McLaren are serious about defending their titles in 2026, then repeating the complexity of the Papaya rules would be the least rational move they could make. The new regulations have already introduced enough instability, a radically different power unit philosophy without the MGU-H, far greater variability off the line due to turbo lag, and a significant reduction in high-speed downforce that reshapes the competitive balance. This is a season in which technical execution alone could define the championship. Oscar Piastri enters it from a very different position. He fell short by just 13 points last year. He led the standings for longer than anyone else. He matched Lando Norris across qualifying and demonstrated a clear upward trajectory in consistency. Objectively, he is not a supporting act. He is a legitimate title contender. In that context, any internal directive that restricts his freedom to race would not merely look cautious. It would appear strategically self-defeating. Some would inevitably frame it as sabotage by another name. Piastri was clear that there were no bad intentions in 2025, but in 2026, good intentions will not be enough. So the critical question is this: will McLaren genuinely allow performance to determine hierarchy, or risk revisiting internal structures that could once again distort a championship fight? If you want to understand why that decision could define the entire 2026 season, stay with us to the end, and consider subscribing so you don't miss what comes next. Because the technical backdrop alone is severe enough to test any organization. The removal of the MGU-H has fundamentally altered how these cars behave at low revs, and crucially, at race starts. Drivers have already warned that launches could become chaotic. George Russell described the starts as not straightforward. Esteban Ocon called turbo lag a very big topic. Pierre Gasly went further, urging fans to be sitting with your TV on in Australia because it could be one that everybody remembers. Piastri himself has acknowledged that the new power units are unconventional, adding that everyone is learning a lot about how to get the most out of the power units this week. He admitted the cars are certainly different, noting that high-speed performance in terms of downforce is significantly less than last year. Even the adaptation process has taken a toll. Nelson Valkenburg observed that Lando Norris looked mentally spent after a full day in Bahrain, though Norris told him he enjoyed the learning process, likening it to being back at school. That matters, because when drivers are already stretched by technical complexity, any additional political or procedural friction inside the team becomes exponentially more damaging. In 2025, McLaren's Papaya rules were designed to maintain harmony and maximize points. In practice, they created moments of tension that lingered far beyond the checkered flag. At Monza, Piastri handed back a position to Norris after a slow pit stop. In Singapore and Austin, the pair clashed on track. The debate around internal bias became so loud that it reached the Australian Parliament, where Senator Matt Canavan questioned whether McLaren's approach had effectively cost Piastri a world championship.
So do you think McLaren is biased against Oscar Piastri and costing him the World Championship?
You're asking me for an opinion there.
Good answer. What about you, Minister?
I definitely think he's copped some raw decisions this year, and someone with a daughter who's become obsessed with F1, she will be very upset when she gets up this morning.
Yeah, this is on behalf of my children too. Yeah. Thank you, Chair.
Piastri rejected the notion of sabotage outright. At no point were there any bad intentions, or certainly no sabotage, Amy said, but he also conceded that there are things that we could have done a better job of, things we could have done differently. That nuance is critical. There is a difference between malicious intent and structural disadvantage. Piastri has been careful not to inflame the situation publicly. Instead, he has framed the 2026 approach as one of refinement. I think it is just streamlining it, really, he explained when asked about the evolution of the Papaya rules. He admitted that last year McLaren got ourselves into some scenarios we didn't need to necessarily, and added a lot more stress to certain things than was probably necessary. Over the off-season, he said, the team had taken time to look back on that and realize that there are things we need to do differently. This is not the language of a driver agitating for special treatment. It is the language of someone who recognizes that marginal inefficiencies, when multiplied across a season, cost championships. And 2026 will be defined by margins. Ted Kravitz suggested after the first Bahrain test that McLaren looked like the fourth best team behind Ferrari, Mercedes, and Red Bull. Piastri himself admitted uncertainty about where the team truly sits in the pecking order. It kind of looks like the top 4 teams are still the top 4 teams, but I don't know where exactly we sit in that at the moment, he said. In other words, there is no dominant cushion. No guarantee that raw pace alone will override operational missteps. This is precisely why internal clarity matters. David Coulthard believes Piastri can be more consistent over the year than he managed last year, suggesting that could make life more difficult for Lando. He pointed out that until Baku, Piastri was the man most likely before, in his words, the wheels came off the wagon. Naomi Schiff echoed that view, noting that Piastri comes back stronger every year and could well repeat the internal duel of 2025 with even greater authority. Statistically, the foundation is already there. 9 wins from 70 Grands Prix, 6 pole positions, podium finishes in nearly 40% of his starts, a 12-12 qualifying tie with Norris across the 2025 season, and a 16-14 edge when sprint sessions are included. These are not the numbers of a compliant number 2. Yet Norris enters 2026 as the reigning world champion, carrying the number 1 on his car. That inevitably shapes perception, externally and internally. Piastri's management reshuffle, with Mark Webber focusing more on the commercial side and former F2 engineer Pedro Matos taking on coaching responsibilities, signals a driver intent on tightening every controllable variable. The uncontrollable ones are precisely why Papaya rules cannot become a distraction. If turbo lag costs a driver 6 positions at the start, as Piastri has warned could become the norm, then race strategy becomes reactive. If downforce loss in high-speed corners alters tyre behaviour, long-run pace fluctuates. If adapting to the new power unit drains mental energy, decision-making windows shrink. Layer on top of that ambiguous team directives about position swaps or point protection, and you create a volatile mix. McLaren's stated objective is to go racing as fairly as we can whilst trying to get the most points for the team. Piastri himself acknowledged that context matters. It's a bit different if you're fighting for first and second in the World Championship or a little bit further back. That conditional thinking may have been manageable under stable regulations. Under sweeping technical change, it risks paralysis. Because if both drivers are genuine title contenders, and the evidence suggests they are, then prioritizing one too early could fracture momentum. Conversely, refusing to define boundaries at all could recreate the stress Piastri alluded to. This is the tightrope Andrea Stella and Zak Brown must walk. Zak Brown will be keen to preserve the harmony that underpinned McLaren's constructors' success, but history shows that 2 number 1 drivers in one team rarely coexist without friction when a championship is on the line. And now the external environment is less forgiving. Verstappen has criticised the new cars, likening them to Formula E on steroids, and describing aspects of the regulations as anti-racing. Lewis Hamilton compared the power unit's feel to Formula 2 machinery. Across the grid, there is unease. That collective uncertainty means opportunity, but only for teams that eliminate self-inflicted wounds. For Piastri, 2026 represents a narrowing window. He's no longer building experience, he is capitalizing on it. If McLaren's design proves competitive and the team avoids internal miscalculations, he has every statistical and developmental argument to mount a sustained title assault. But if Papaya rules once again create scenarios that require mid-race recalibration, position reversals, or strategic compromise, the debate will resurface. Not because of conspiracy, but because of consequence. And in Formula 1, perception follows outcome. So the real issue is not whether McLaren intend to sabotage anyone. It is whether they can afford even the appearance of doing so in a season where every lost point may be irrecoverable. If technical execution defines 2026, then political restraint inside the garage could be just as decisive. The question is whether McLaren have truly learned from 2025, or whether the instinct to control will override the logic of competitive freedom. Because if Oscar Piastri is once again within striking distance of a championship and Papaya rules intervene at a critical moment, the narrative will not be kind.